Good morning. I think it's just about time for us to get into our class this morning. We'll be in Acts chapter 14 as we continue our study, as we see the continued spread of the gospel. Last week we started into Paul's first missionary journey. This week in chapter 14, our plan is to finish looking at his first missionary journey and to see how that concludes. And we'll see a number of really important things in chapter 14 as far as Paul's persistence and just how important the gospel is as far as the spread of it and the amount he was willing to endure in order to continue spreading it. We really see that come out vividly in chapter 14 through some of the persecutions. I'd say chapter 14 is we see one of the worst persecutions that Paul has to endure for the gospel in this chapter. And so we'll see him continuing on with preaching it after that takes place. And so we really see some important things in Acts chapter 14. And before we get started in with our text, would you bow with me? We'll have a word of prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to you for allowing us to study your word. Father, we thank you for the message that we have in the book of Acts, that we can see the way that your word was spread throughout the world. And Father, that we can see tactics and methods for evangelism, that we can see the way that we can see the power of your word in its spread in this book. And Father, I pray that as we look at Acts chapter 14, that we would be impressed with the importance of sharing your word, Father, because of the persistence of those that we read about. And Father, I pray that as we learn from your word, that we would go from here with more determination, more motivation to live, to be more like Jesus. It's in Christ's name that I pray. Amen. And so in this chapter, again, we see the persistence of the missionaries in carrying the gospel to others. Even though they're going to face difficulty or they faced some difficulty before this point in other places, we're going to see that escalate some. The opposition in this chapter is the worst up to this point. And so in chapter 14, beginning in verse 1, it says, "In Iconium they entered the synagogue and spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both of Jews and Greeks. But the Jews who disbelieved stirred up the minds of the Gentiles and embittered them against the brethren. Therefore they spent a long time there, speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who was testifying to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding region. And there they continued to preach the gospel." And so we see a persistence in carrying out the gospel and just in this first section. The section before this, right at the end of chapter 13, we have another city that they were driven out of and what precedes this. And so we see kind of a pattern here in this section, verses 50 to 52 of chapter 13. "The Jews incited the devout women of prominence and the leading men of the city and instigated a persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their district. So they shook off the dust of their feet in protest against them and went to Iconium. And the disciples were continually filled with joy in the Holy Spirit." And so this isn't the first time they've been driven out or they've left because of a persecution or because of a plan for something worse. And so they go to Iconium. And Paul, again, he goes to the synagogue first in preaching the gospel. We saw that, we established that, and we looked at it last week, how his mode of operation, he always starts with the synagogue and then goes out from there. He goes to where he knows there are people who fear God, where there's some common ground as far as the background. And so we see that again in Iconium. He goes to the synagogue first. And the work in this city began successfully. It says in verse 1, that he spoke in such a manner that a large number of people believed, both Jews and Greeks. And so it starts off really well in Iconium. But the Jews instigated a persecution against Paul and Barnabas there in the same way as had happened in previous cities. And even in the midst of this, it says that they spent a long time there, long enough to establish the church, as we'll see later in this chapter. The city was divided about how they felt about what was going on, about the message that was being preached. And eventually there was a plan made by some to stone them for preaching, so they left. And this is just as Jesus predicted that, the gospel would divide people. In Luke chapter 12, if we look back at, we know Acts was written by Luke. If we look back at his previous writing in Luke chapter 12 and what he recorded about Jesus telling his followers. In Luke 12:49 and following, Jesus said, "There I have come to cast fire upon the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and how distressed I am until it's accomplished. Do you suppose that I came to grant peace on earth? I tell you no, but rather division. From now on, 5 members in one household will be divided against, or 5 members in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law." And so Jesus predicts it's not that he wants a division to come as a result of the gospel, but this is what's going to happen. He's predicting this is just going to be the result of the gospel being preached. It's going to create divisions between people. And we see that in Iconium. The city is divided about how they feel about the gospel. There are some who believe, and there are some who are adamantly against Paul and Barnabas because of the message, to the extent that we see they have a plan to put them to death. And so it's a very polarized situation. You have some that are completely for them, and some that are so against them that they're ready to resort to violence. Yes, and so we've got, just because he started in the synagogue doesn't mean that's the only people that were hearing the message. It's not the only people that he was preaching to. And so you're right, this is a mix of people, and that could be something, as we see with the Jew-Gentile issues, at least some piece of what's bringing about this problem, that he's not just preaching to Jews or just preaching to Jewish people and the proselytes, but we know that as we look through the epistles throughout the New Testament, we see that's a problem that comes up over and over again, is this mix. And we see once they come into the church, although there's unity in Christ, there's definitely some friction as they come together in the church as things are being worked out. But the city is divided about what's going on, and we see that Jesus predicted that divisions would come as a result of the preaching of the gospel. There was a plan that was made to stone them, and at this point they decided, okay, we need to move on. They became aware of it, and they fled to the cities of Lycaonia and Lystra and Derbe and the surrounding region, and they continued to preach the gospel. And that's again another one of these themes that we see coming up throughout the book of Acts. They were persecuted over here, so they left and they went somewhere else, and they kept right on proclaiming the good news. They didn't let it stop them. And I think really, at least to me, one of the most impressive instances of that is what we're going to see a little bit further down in this chapter. The fact that after some of what happens, specifically in Lystra, that's one of the most impressive displays of faith, that Paul would get up and go right back to preaching after what happens in Lystra. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself on that. We'll get there in just a minute. And so we get to verses 8 and following, and we'll go on and read down a significant section of the chapter now, just so that we can keep it all together and in context. Verse 8, "At Lystra there was a man sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man was listening to Paul as he spoke, who, when he had fixed his gaze on him and he had seen that he had faith to be made well, said with a loud voice, 'Stand up right on your feet.' And he leaped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, 'The gods have become like men and have come down to us.' And they began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and he wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, 'Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and earth and the sea and all that's in them. In the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even saying these things, with difficulty they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. So that's quite a reaction that we have from the people in Lystra. And so we have at first, Paul gets there, he heals a lame man. And as we see with other miracles that are done in the proclaiming of the gospel, the point being to give credibility to the message. You know, they come in preaching that, you know, this man Jesus was raised from the dead. People are going to be saying, yeah, right, that can't happen. And then whenever Paul looks at somebody that everybody knows has never walked, has never been able to walk, has been lame since he was born, and he says, okay, you get up, and he does. Well, what were you saying about somebody raising from the dead again? All of a sudden, it makes a little bit more sense because they see something happen that's impossible. And so it gives credibility to what they're preaching. It gives credibility to the message. And the reaction of the crowd is that they see this, and instead of saying, okay, what are you saying, and listening to the message, they carry it a little bit too far and say, well, you must be God yourself. And they begin, within their own pagan worldview, they think this is Zeus and Hermes that have come down, the incarnation of two of their pagan gods. And so and this isn't just for the sake of keeping this in the context of the book of Acts. This is not the only time that something like this will happen. Over in Acts 28, whenever Paul was on the island of Malta, he says, the natives showed us, this is Acts 28, verse 2, the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out, and because of the heat, it fastened itself on his hand. And when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. And so as people see the miraculous things going on, this is something that happens on more than one occasion. These must be gods. Well, they have a chance to speak, but it kind of sets them up where this is going a different direction than maybe they had hoped it to go. And so they began to call him Zeus and Hermes, and you've got it says the priest of Zeus, he's bringing sacrifices, he's got oxen, he's coming in, he's ready to have a full-blown pagan ritual service to them. It says they tore their clothes. That's a sign of, we see that all throughout Scripture. We see it in the Old Testament, we see it in the New Testament, a sign of extreme distress, a sign of something is very, very wrong here. And so you see Paul and Barnabas, they're very upset at this, because of course they're not willing to accept worship, just as Peter wouldn't allow Cornelius to bow before him in worship. And they explain, we're men just like you. And we preach to you a gospel that you should turn from these vain things to a living God. He shared with them that they're not gods, but men like everyone else. Turn from these vain things you're doing right here, right now, that you're trying to set up. And, in Paul's case, the things you're trying to set up in our honor, this is vain. Because they're seeing him as part of their pagan worldview. These vain things that he's talking about there being idolatry. And we see all through Scripture the foolishness of idolatry. One place that comes out really particularly strongly is in Psalm 115. And I think let's turn over and look at a few verses there, and we see, as Paul calls what they're doing, they're these vain things. We see what the psalmist says, Psalm 115, we'll look at verses 1 through 9. And we get a view of just Really a vivid picture of the vanity of idolatrous worship. Psalm 115, beginning in verse 1, says, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, because of your loving kindness, because of your truth. Why should the nations say, where now is their God? But our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throat. Those who make them will become like them, everyone who trusts in them." And so he talks here about the foolishness, and then you've got verse 9 there, the contrast where he turns around, he says, "O Israel, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield." Well, and you see that, and you think about the foolishness of worshiping a God that can't stand up for themselves. It reminds me of whenever Gideon had to take down the idols from his own father's household, and the men of the city were so upset they were ready to come out against Gideon. And Gideon's father said, "If Baal's God, let him contend for himself." But again, we see there in Psalm 115, these so-called gods can't do anything. And so Paul here, he's saying, turn from these vain things. They're getting ready to set up a pagan worship service, thinking that Paul and Barnabas are the incarnation of these pagan gods. And he said, no, that's not it at all. Let me tell you about the one who created everything.
They have ears, but they can't hear prayers.
That's it. Well, it is. And again, to kind of, I guess, to think about another example of that's whenever Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and it says for all of these hours they were up on Mount Carmel and they're hopping around and cutting themselves and making this massive spectacle of themselves, and nothing happens. And Elijah's there mocking them, saying, "Well, maybe shout a little louder. He might be on a trip and can't hear you." And after they finally get done and there's nothing that happens, Elijah prays to God, and before that he had them dig a trench around the altar, pours water all in the trench, fills the trench up, drenches the sacrifice, drenches the wood and the stones. This thing is completely soaking wet. He prays, and fire comes from heaven, dries all the water up, takes the altar, takes the wood, takes the sacrifice, takes everything. The difference between the living God and these idols. And when Paul says these vain things, these things that are empty, these things that are nothing, you turn away from those. I've come to you to preach a message to you to turn away from this of the Creator, the one who has power, the one who spoke and the worlds came into being. We also, men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. He talks about how in generations past he permitted the nations to go their own ways. It's not to say that God has approved of their idolatry, but because of course we know God doesn't approve of false religion, but these other nations at that time, they weren't guided in the same way that Israel was with the law and with the prophets. But even at that, he says, God still made himself evident through the blessings that he sent, through the rains, through what he has shown himself. It's like Paul said in Romans, that through what's made, God has made himself evident. He has shown himself to be, he has shown his glory through what he's made, through just what he's created in nature. And so Paul, states that to them. Even in what he's done in that case, he's made himself evident to these people. And it says, with difficulty that they were able to restrain the crowds from offering sacrifices. Imagine being in such a position that it takes real effort to keep a whole crowd of people from worshiping you, thinking you're a god. Ken? I'd be interested to see if he could create more joy in a faithful Christian who understands who God is through science. That's an interesting point. I hadn't heard that one, but Like you said, we have our gods, or as Paul would put it, we have our vain things that we worship today. Whether it be science, or whether it be influence, or money, or power, or entertainment, or whatever it is, we have all kinds of vain things that we put on the throne in our lives today, and we got to be careful of that. We keep our focus on the one who created us, on the one who came here to save us. Christian? Yes, we have to keep our eyes on him. Like you said, science really is one of the greatest assets that we can look and we can see evidence for God, unless, like you say, we misread it. That's absolutely right. As you mentioned, one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess the truth that Jesus is Lord, that he is the Christ. That's absolutely right. And so, but we've got this situation where they're trying to worship Paul and Barnabas, thinking they're these pagan gods. And they turn them away. There's a contrast. You remember whenever, Herod, just a couple of chapters earlier, they started shouting at Herod, the voice of a God, not of a man. And well, he kind of liked that. So he just let them keep on going. And it says that God struck him and he was eaten by worms and died. We have a contrast here. They pointed people to the true God. Hey, we've got some attention. No, we're not gods. But let us tell you about the real one. And so they use the attention to preach the gospel. But then you get to verse 19. And we have a situation where it turns a 180, where they've been able to preach the gospel and up to this point. And it says, but the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. They must have been some pretty persuasive individuals. But you think about what was going on in Lystra up to this point. They wanted to worship them as gods. The Jews show up, and you know what? I think we'll kill you instead. I would love to hear just exactly how did they go about making that argument. How were they so persuasive? But you see the city, what's going on there, the reaction really turns a major corner there. They stone him, they drag him out of the city, but while the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city, and the next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. After they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, and having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And so we have the persecution beginning in Lystra in this situation. And Paul, in writing to Timothy, he makes specific reference to this in telling Timothy. In 2 Timothy 3:12, he says, indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Contextually, in that letter to Timothy, in the two verses that precede that, he says, you remember how we were treated in Antioch and Iconium and Lystra. And so when he's talking about how Christians, those who would follow Jesus, can expect to be treated this way, he makes reference to this persecution. He warned Timothy that if he was to do the work of Christ, he would be treated in a similar way. And the temptation in such a situation would be to write off evangelism in this kind of place, just to assume, well, it's not worth it. Let's go somewhere else. Much like we see that there were many who would have done with Saul of Tarsus. But as we consider specifically the work done in Lystra, not to mention, and we've already seen in this text, there were churches established because as they went back into these cities, again, verse 21 is one of the most impressive verses in the book of Acts to me because it says they returned to Lystra. They drug him out of the city and tried to kill him, and he said a little while later, you know what, I think I'll go back. That's how important the gospel was. That's how important strengthening the church was. And we know he established the church there, but as we can consider, that alone is enough to say, yes, it's worth it. But do you know what else came out of Lystra? We go over to Acts chapter 16. We have Paul going back to Lystra yet again. It says, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Because of Paul's work in Lystra, he gained a travel companion that we read about in Acts 17. Because of Paul's work in Lystra, the Corinthian church was taught and was built up, 1 Corinthians 4 tells us. Because of his work in Lystra, the Thessalonian church was strengthened, because he makes reference to Timothy's work there in 1 Thessalonians 3. The church in Ephesus was matured because Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, "For this reason I left you at Ephesus," and he goes on to give him his purpose for being there. Because of his work in Lystra, there were many of these churches that were built up and strengthened. There are other times that Timothy's mentioned. This is just a few of them that I've listed here in order to show that the work in Lystra was not fruitless, because there was a church established there and a disciple made there who traveled with Paul, who did very important work in a number of different places. In this case, one of the most difficult works was very rewarding, if from nothing else, from the impact that Timothy would have in cities all over. Because Paul didn't give up. Bill? That's right. Like you said, they thought they had completed their mission of putting him to death. I can imagine how rough he must have looked when he got back up. And I think, it's interesting, he returned to Lystra and Iconium and to Antioch. He strengthens the church because it's that important. Number one, he goes back. He encourages them to continue in the faith, and saying, I think it's really interesting, the quote they have here from him, given what's just happened: "Through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God." He doesn't really have to give any illustrations of that because they're looking at him. That's a really good point, that he may see some of himself in some of these people. Yeah, they tried to put me to death the same way he was there when Stephen was put to death. And he may see more opportunity there as he continues to persist in working in that town. Jimmy? It's important that we keep a focus on God, like you say, whenever tragedies hit, because for the church, seeing one of their leaders being left with people thinking thinking he was dead, that would have been, something of a tragedy in their minds. And then he gets back up, and you think about the encouragement that would be, that he keeps on going, that he keeps on preaching. They've been run out of town now after town after town, and now he gets drug out of a city and stoned, and he keeps on going because the gospel is that important. Because eternity is that important. It's like Paul would say to the Philippians, to live as Christ, to die as gain. He's going to keep living on in this life. He said, I'm going to keep on preaching. He's going to continue to do the work of Christ, but he understands that even if he is killed for it, he gets to go be with him. What an outlook. And we see that come through really vividly. We see that come through in what he does, that he puts his money where his mouth is here. But Paul goes back into these cities to strengthen the church. These are definitely churches that would need encouragement. If Paul was stoned for the gospel, I can't really imagine that the people in the city would be more friendly towards those he's converted. Just because they've only stoned Paul doesn't mean they're being friendly to the rest of the church. And so these are definitely churches that would need strength and encouragement. These Christians were seeing the enemy attack them early on for their faith. And what he's telling them, he's encouraging them to stand firm. Like he told the church in Ephesus to stand firm, put on the full armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. He's got a very important message for them because the enemy is out to get them, and there's some pretty strong persecution in that place. He shared with them that tribulations are to be expected, as they've already seen. That's exactly what happens when the enemy's attack, difficulties and tribulations for Christians in some way or another. Jesus warned that the world would hate his disciples. He said, the world hated me, it's going to hate you too. But he kept on preaching. And that's why this section here, verse in Acts 14:19 down to about 23, is one of the most impressive sections as far as we consider the mission work of Paul, or what we read about the evangelism in the New Testament, the way that went about. That's one of the most impressive sections to see that it got to the point that they thought he was dead. He got up And he kept on going. He strengthened the churches. They appointed elders in the church. They appointed leadership in the churches, prayed and fasted, commended them to the Lord, in whom they'd believe. And then the end of the chapter, verses 24 to 28, they get back to Antioch, where they have been sent off from. The beginning of chapter 13, they've now completed this first missionary journey. They passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had accomplished. And when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent a long time with the disciples. We have the mission report back in Antioch in Syria. It specifically states there they've returned to the place that they had been commissioned to the work. And so now this is something of a closure of this specific journey that they have. They've been sent out, they go do the work, now they come back and say, okay, here's what happened. They gathered the church together and gave a report. It gives a biblical precedent for missionary reports. And as we know, if we're supporting someone to go somewhere to another part of the world and share the gospel, when they come back and say, we've baptized this many people, we've appointed leadership in a church, we've done this, is that not encouraging? That's exciting to hear. And that's exactly what Paul is doing. You sent us out, and here's what's happened. It's important to hear from the missionaries that are sent out. Now, Antioch knows what's been accomplished by those that they've sent, by those that they've given resources and support to. It's a source of encouragement for the church. And supporting missionaries is a participation in the Great Commission. In Philippians chapter 4, Paul speaks about this to that church specifically. In Philippians 4 and verse 17, he talks about their participation in the work. In talking about their support of him, he says, not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek for the profit which increases to your account. For that church that is supporting him and doing the work, he says, this is profitable for you, because as we support those who are going to places that we can't to do the work, God sees that. As we enable the proclamation of the gospel, God sees that. Because missionary work requires both the one who goes, but also those who will send. But notice specifically as they report, verse 27, they gathered the church, they began to report all the things that God had done. This wasn't a time for Paul and Barnabas to stand up in front of Antioch and say, look at us. He said, here's what God did while we were gone. The way this is worded shows that they gave credit to God for the profitability. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, Peter says, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that's exactly what this mission report did. They didn't go on and on about their good work. They went on and on about God's good work. It shows a humility. It shows the proper perspective. Their report, just like their preaching, pointed to God. It's like what Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians 3. I planted, Apollos watered, but God caused the growth. And so when they go back to Antioch to say, here's what happened on this mission trip, they said, here's what God did. Jimmy? I'm not sure. I didn't see anything in my studies on that. That's not to say that it's not out there, but I'm not exactly sure myself. Like you mentioned, there are several times when it says they were there for a prolonged time. I don't have an answer for that at the moment. But that's not to say, like I said, that it's not out there. I just didn't run across that. So we get to the end of chapter 14. We have a closure of this first missionary journey. We have churches established, church leadership has been set up in some of these churches. We see the persistence of the missionaries, and above all, we see the greatness of God's been proclaimed, and God's been given the credit for the work that's been done. And so we'll finish out this morning. We've got just 1 or 2 minutes left before the second bell rings. And so we'll conclude there with the end of this first missionary journey, and we'll conclude our class this morning with a prayer. So would you bow with me? Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to you for allowing us to study your word. Father, you give us every spiritual blessing through Christ, and we thank you so much, Lord, but it's not enough for us to say thank you because you've given us more than what we even realize. We so often, unfortunately, take it for granted, Father, but we thank you that you provide for us in every need, especially those spiritual needs. And Father, that I thank you that as we've studied this first missionary journey over the last couple of weeks, I thank you for the message that we see of the importance of the gospel. And I pray that we would take that to heart, that we would understand that eternity is what's at stake for those who would hear the gospel, Father. And I pray that we would understand the importance of it and proclaim your word to the people around us. But Father, as you bless your church here, and we thank you so much for your church, for allowing us to call you Father. But Father, as you bless your church here in Puyallup, Father, I pray that we would have the humility to give you credit for the blessings that we have and for the progress of the gospel, rather than to think ourselves as more important than we are, but to look to you and to give you credit for all that you do. Father, I pray we would be persistent in carrying the gospel, that we wouldn't get discouraged when someone is not interested, but that we would continue to seek others out. Father, because your word is that important, eternity is that important, Father, I pray that we would understand the mission, that we would understand the gravity of the mission, and that we would continue with it, Lord, and that we would strive to be more like Jesus each and every day. It's in Christ's name that I pray. Amen.